Hello, and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence, and we have fun doing it. I'm Justin. I'm coming at you from the center right. Today, I'm really excited. We're going to be talking about immigration policy and economics. There's going to be a lot of process. And, as an engineer, I love process. I'm data driven. I like to read between the lines and sniff out any bullshit and get rid of it.
All right. I'm Jonathan. I'm bringing you the more professorial approach, as I am a professor. And I also love it when we get into process and economics. And hopefully, we don't dig into the weeds too much to scare anybody away. Since we're dealing with economics, I decided to go full on international today. I have my Italian beer shirt today. So a shout out to the Blind Pig in Naples, as well as the Oak in Naples, both good beer bars in Italy, which is somewhat of a surprise to me to find out how great the beer scene is in Italy, and I recommend it heartily. I did go with a local beer today, got Maine Brewing's Wolf Neck IPA, because they a lot of the proceeds here go to sort of an agricultural research and sustainable farming kind of thing. Also, I had an urge from Maine beer after we talked so much about ranked choice voting before, and I'm very happy whenever I see Maine Brewing at our local store, so I got some of that.
And for all the people who thought the beer would be from Mexico, well, shame on you.
Well, there's plenty of ways to be international or not, or progressive.
We really want to talk about the top issues of the election for this segment. Economics, specifically inflation, is a top priority. And we're going to go into the immigration policies for both Trump and Harris. So Trump, he has Agenda 47 as well as Project 2025. And Harris, while it's not fully fleshed out, you can surmise based on her being vice president that she's going to continue a lot of the Biden administration policies. So enjoy. Okay, so we are going to talk at a high level about both Trump and Harris's immigration policy. And then we're going to do the deep dive a little later after we kind of go through the history of how we got here. So Trump, he's basically, he has something called Agenda 47. It's a very high level and easily digestible set of policies, things such as stop the migrant invasion, seal the border, stuff like that.
Lock her up.
Yes. I think we should spend some time figure out what kind of drives this. It's really based on nativism. There's this really strong desire to preserve American culture. So what is American culture, right? Well, it's us, real America, versus them, the fake Americans, the elites, the globalists. And the implementation strategy for Agenda 47 is Project 2025. Do not listen to Trump when he says he has no idea what that is. We will go into why that is nonsensical a bit later. And now on to Harris. Her policies aren't particularly fleshed out yet. We can surmise that she would continue a lot of the Biden administration's immigration and border policies. In her State of the Union speech, it's not State of the Union, her convention speech, she said that she would sign the bipartisan border security bill if it was on her desk. So how did we get here? Immigration policy didn't just fall out of a coconut tree, right?
You've been saving that joke for weeks, haven't you?
Oh, yes. There's been considerable shifts on both the policy side as well as the root causes of immigration. Under the Obama administration, when it came to the financial crisis, you just had a lot of people overstaying their visas. You had a lot of poverty and violence coming from the Northern Triangle countries, which are, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And then you had a dip with COVID, and now there's just asylum abuse. So let's go back to the Obama administration. There have been many attempts, like really good faith attempts, to solve some of the problems that we encounter. Um, During the Obama administration, there was something called the Gang of Eight bill. And, they just wanted to adjust the immigration policies based on the economic realities of the time, such as, increasing visas for STEM workers, seasonal workers, things like that. The real sticking point, though, was the pathway to citizenship for people who are already here illegally. Republicans like to call that amnesty. My read on this is that, there would be so many hoops that they have to jump through. It would take over 10 years. So I think it was a reasonable request, provided that they, don't have any criminal record or something like that. But
so one thing I do think we need to just spell clear for people who might be a little confused, like actually I was when you first reminded me of it, the Gang of Eight bill does not refer to the Gang of Eight that get the intelligence updates when there's a crisis in the country. There's a special Gang of Eight that assembled for this. But the other thing I wanted to mention too is like that was like sort of far from the first try, right? This has been going on for a long time. Right. There was a big effort under President George W. Bush that ended up getting torpedoed by Republicans because there was some sort of nods towards pathways to citizenship, things like that. This is sort of a recurring theme where a group of people get together, bipartisan usually, and try to advance some sort of immigration reform, and some hardliners come out and say, you know what? No, this is an issue that we campaign on. We're not going to do this. And just one other minor point. This is my beer, fully poured and ready to go. So a nice slight haze to it. Really solid beer for the episode. Anyway, back to you.
Yes. I think that there's this perverse incentive structure to just torpedo these things, as you mentioned, for election purposes, right? Mm-hmm. As long as the issue's on the table, they don't need to actually govern to solve the issues, right? They can just grandstand on it.
Well, anger is a great motivating force, right? And if the Republican, the hardline right-wing Republicans can keep their base angry and turning out, that's an easy path to election that you don't have to worry about as much. If you compromise, then the angrier person can say, hey, they've compromised. All you angry people, now vote for me. And I think that that's a real consideration for a lot of these hardline Republicans, much more so than being completely sold on the merits or problems with the policies.
Right. So, this had large support in the Senate. I believe it was 68 votes in the affirmative. So filibuster proof. But then the House GOP just didn't put it on the floor at all. So Obama decided to take executive action. The main thing that Obama did was creating the DACA program, which allowed dreamers. These are people who came here illegally, but as children. So America really is their home. And so he sent out a DHS memorandum, or was it memoranda? You tell me.
One memorandum, two or more memoranda.
Okay, so a memorandum. And basically saying, hey, you know what? If you meet these requirements, we're not going to deport you. And, because they have prosecutorial discretion, they are allowed to do that. Now we go on to Trump, and, he runs on nativism. We will build the wall. We're going to stop all the awful people from Mexico from coming into this country. He recognized that when you talk in these very simple terms, you can really get people agitated, and his base got really riled up. There were a couple major policy accomplishments that he had. I know we like to say that, he failed to build the wall, but he did try, in some ways illegally. But the so-called Muslim ban, he eventually did get passed.
Sort of. It was watered down, but yeah.
Right. But, he had these attempts, and, while he kind of floundered a bit, he was eventually successful. Mm-hmm. And I must say, we don't necessarily endorse these policies, right? Let's make sure from his perspective.
We should say successful in his eyes.
Right.
Let's make that distinction.
Then he came up with the zero tolerance policy, which basically separated minors from their families, right? By statute, you are allowed to do this. Um, Now, I would argue that this was an abuse of the statute itself, but it was allowed. Um, and this is kind of a recurring theme when it comes to executive authority, right? Obama had his vision for enforcing the law, and Trump had his own vision, right? The statutes didn't really change. But because the executive branch is allowed to selectively enforce laws to a point, you can end up in these sort of situations. Um, and then when COVID happened, I would say that Trump cleverly used Title 42, which deals with public health and communicable diseases, to basically expel as many immigrants as possible.
Again, clever to him.
Yes.
We're not going to endorse that as being particularly clever. But I think on the larger point, right, when Congress refuses to do anything, this is what you get. Presidents can only act through executive action, and you're going to get much more, let's say, partisan approaches, because when you have to act with Congress, there's going to have to be some sort of compromise.
Right.
When the presidents are doing it themselves, they don't have to worry about that so much. So that's, I think, why you get these wild fluctuations, because Congress basically has abdicated its responsibility for coming up with laws.
Yeah. So now we go into the current administration. I think the Biden administration reflexively just saw some of the Trump policies and said, we're not going to do that. So one of the things that they really tried to do was family reunification, right? All the, we can call them victims of the zero tolerance policy. DHS really made an effort to try and get these families back together. I think there was something along the lines of 5,000 to 6,000 children removed from their families. And, other administrations have done this as well, just not to the degree, right? So I know that many...
well, in a different sort of way, right? According to things that my read on it is that other administrations have done it when there were sort of things like custody issues and they had to be resolved, not as a policy to punitively separate families to make their lives more miserable. I think that's the first time this ever happened. I think that's probably where you were going with it. But basically, when Trump says, "Oh, everybody else did it," not really. Nobody did it in the way you did it.
Exactly. The policy was implemented as a way to disincentivize people from coming.
Yep.
The crueler you are, in their eyes, the more successful the border protection will be, because people aren't going to come. And then Biden tried, he actually successfully enhanced DACA by adding additional protections. Trump tried to get rid of DACA, but failed because for procedural reasons. The Supreme Court ruled that he could do it, get rid of it, if he wanted to, but because he didn't follow, certain guidelines, it just remained in place. And now we're in this interesting period of time where we have this really significant amount of people crossing the border, right? And then Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, has engaged in theatrics. I know that Ron DeSantis has as well, the governor of Florida, where they will bus, immigrants. They aren't necessarily illegal, I have to add, all over the country, mainly to what they call sanctuary states or sanctuary cities, such as New York, Chicago, and other large Democratic
We get quite a bit in Denver.
Right. And the whole reason for this is to create a little bit of chaos, to basically say, hey, this is an issue.
Well, I think they're a little bit more vindictive than that. I think they want to try to overwhelm the services that these cities have that aren't close to the border, because they're not used to it, and they're doing a very good job at that.
Right.
All the budgets in all of these major cities are stretched as far as they could possibly go, trying to deal with immigrants that we usually sort of process and take care of more closer to the border. So he's certainly had an impact of raising the issue, the profile of the issue in these blue states that usually don't think about it as much.
Yeah. So I don't want to endorse, the tactics here,
Certainly not.
but I do think that there is a legitimate argument to be made that this the border issue has been put on the back burner by the Biden administration. The Biden administration has focused mainly on COVID and a lot of foreign policy, mainly the war in Ukraine, and getting other major pieces of legislation passed. So it's always been like a second thought.
Well, I mean,
There
I think
isn't
you should throw domestic economy in there too. That's I think
right, yeah,
a big
inflation,
focus.
yeah, and it's not particularly coherent, right? Biden did keep the Title 42 policy in place to keep people from entering the country.
Mm.
And then it was just this awkward situation where he would have to say he doesn't support it, but then he would argue in front of the Supreme Court that he does support it. And, there is a health emergency, but there isn't. It just was a bit sloppy there. And then we are here now where, there's this bipartisan Border Security Act that was supposed to be tied to aid in Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. And the GOP basically acted in bad faith, in my opinion. James Langford, worked really hard on this bill. He's a pretty conservative senator from Oklahoma. He worked with Kristen Sinema, and you know what? Biden had to take some executive action to help relieve the stresses on the border. So let's talk about Project 2025 right now. So,
and I think it's useful to remind our audience that, right, Trump says, "Oh, I have no connection with 2025," right?
But it has some good ideas.
Yeah, that's true. I'm not sure we believe him. Do we believe him, Justin?
No, he is definitely talking out of his ass. And I'll tell you why. So on one hand, border and immigration policy has always been the thing that he cares about, right? There's himself and then the border.
Well, very, very low down the list, but yes, himself. Yeah. Once he gets past himself, if he can do that, it's the border.
There is the author is Ken Cuccinelli. So who is that guy? Well, he served in the Trump administration. He was supposed to be the acting director of United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, which are the people who vet all asylum claims, naturalization, things like that, as well as the acting Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. But guess what? He was unlawfully appointed. So his official title was senior official performing these duties. And after his appointment was ruled unlawful, he still served in the Trump administration up until he left. So we're going to get into why that little tidbit is interesting a bit later, once we start talking about some of these policy proposals. So with the DHS section, it's not that long. It's, on the order of, 20, 25 pages, but half of it is dedicated to border security and immigration. DHS is a huge organization, which includes the Coast Guard, FEMA, cybersecurity, TSA, things like that. So the fact that all these other agencies combined are talked about less than border and immigration policy really goes to show you how important this issue is to Trump, and how there's basically no daylight between Agenda 47 and Project 2025 when it comes to immigration and border policy.
To me, I think that's the key here, right? Because it could be long because Ken Cuccinelli is long-winded, which he is if you've ever seen him. But I think that, as you're talking about, that if you compare Trump's 47 plan to what's in there in Project 2025, this, I think, is the issue where you can see the most direct parallels. And I think that, to me, is the most convincing aspect, that they really kind of do mean it when they have the stuff in here that they're talking about.
Yeah. So they're very aggressive in how they want to implement things. On day one, they want to make as many people as acting secretaries, acting officials as possible. Um, I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but people acting in this capacity have less authority as someone who's confirmed by the Senate, but they are able to perform quite a few duties. Um, and
Well, I think
going
the big
back,
thing to note too, right, is that they don't have to be confirmed by the Senate.
right,
So you can propose any whack job in the world and make them acting, and then they can go about and do whatever they feel like doing, like implement Project 2025. Because if you have to go through the Senate, at least you have to have somewhat of a pretense of
yeah,
being rational and not being completely outlandish. The Senate will once in a while reject somebody who's completely unsuited for the job.
yes, there is more accountability for sure. And so that's what's interesting about Ken Cuccinelli, because he feels victimized to an extent, right? And
Well,
so
yes, this certainly reads like a list of Ken Cuccinelli's grievances.
exactly. So he really wants to kind of stick it to our system of checks and balances. Um, there is an emphasis of skirting the Administrative Procedures Act as much as possible. Really briefly, um, this allows agencies to create de facto laws that are so nitty gritty that Congress really can't. Congress doesn't have the expertise to really deal with. And so we have these procedures that allow for rulemaking to occur. And they want to bypass that too, because that takes too long. Another interesting thing that they're proposing is they want to combine these immigration agencies. So we have CBP, the Customs and Border Protection. They're the ones in charge of securing the border. You have Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They're the ones who actually enforce the law. They handle deportations, human trafficking investigations, and things like that. And then you have Citizenship and Immigration Services. So they're the ones who handle visa applications, asylum claims, naturalization. Now, these three agencies often work together, right? That makes sense. They're under DHS. But they do have different mandates. What I found particularly interesting is that Cuccinelli is proposing that we just combine them into one mega agency. And the reason for that is he wants to reduce friction. Well, that seems strange, right? Because there's often competing mandates, sometimes adversarial, right? Well, I think this goes to show you why having them in one agency will shift the direction of these types of mandates.
Well, and I think that's the important point of going through all this exercise, right? Because it doesn't really matter in a vacuum what their procedures are for getting
Right.
people appointed, or what sort of rulemaking things they're going to do, or where they're going to put people. But what it matters is the output, the impact of this. And what's going to happen is these three agencies will be now all of a sudden, their mandates, as you talk about right now, are different. That's not going to be the case if they're put together. Basically, their mandate is stop people from coming here and get them out once they're here.
Right.
And he's right that by combining them and putting them into one group with one mandate of, hey, this is what we're going to do, it'll make it much easier for him to try to do that. Right. If he's presumably somewhat involved in the new DHS program in a new Trump administration. But that to me is where I look at it and I'm like, I see what you're doing. But like you said, let's read between the lines here. And why are you doing this? Oh, you're doing this just so forget all the other things that these people do with immigrants. Let's stop them from coming and get them out if they make it through.
Yeah. Let's reject asylum claims. Let's make naturalization a pain in the ass. All
Yep.
these things.
Yeah. At every turn, we'll put up obstacles. That's what this reorganization, to me, seems designed to do. And it seems to be pretty clear that they don't really make any bones about it, right? They want to, right. They tell you they don't want people here, and they want to cut down on illegal immigration and legal immigration as well. But we're not going to get into that today.
Right. And then they also want to absorb different offices from other agencies. So Health and Human Services, they have an Office of Refugee Resettlement. DHS wants to take that. Department of Justice has Immigration and Case Review. DHS wants to take that. So when you start looking at these things, when it comes to absorbing aspects of other agencies, it becomes somewhat scary, I think, because you're just going to have way less accountability.
Scary if you're an immigrant, right? Because they've
Yeah,
taken all the things that presumably right now are designed to provide aid or help or whatever to immigrants who we decide deserve asylum or whatnot, and this moving it over to this new organization whose complete and total focus is get people out of here.
right. So there will be a lot of people who have legitimate asylum claims who deserve to be here because they've been prosecuted by a government due to their religion or something like that. Well, too bad, so sad is what's going to happen. Um, so there's a lot of different policies that they're proposing that are really nitty gritty. I do want to go over some of them that really stuck out to me as like, whew, boy, that's a doozy there. So they want to eliminate the immigration detention ombudsman. So what the heck is an ombudsman? Um, these people are advocates to make sure that the government is doing their job when it comes to immigration detention, and that it's within regulations, right? It's intentionally adversarial, similar to an inspector general. And they want to eliminate it. They probably won't be able to because it exists by statute. But what they can do is they can appoint someone there who really just doesn't care and isn't going to do their job. And then you could conceivably have an immense amount of abuse in these immigration detention centers.
And like you said, that this is completely in keeping with the approach Trump took last time. If he didn't like an inspector general who basically does the same job, that basically try to do a nonpartisan, objective review of how departments are acting, he fired a lot of inspector generals. And he's going to I would imagine he's got the same plans again if he returns, right? If he does not want, clearly, people having review power over what he does that aren't Trump supporters. And that's a lot of what they're trying to do here with the whole idea. Again, we'll get into this at a later time, but another important aspect of Project 2025 is the idea of replacing a lot of bureaucrats with political appointees. Well, this isn't the same kind of thing necessarily, but it's going to have a similar impact. You get rid of people that do the oversight and replace them with yes men or people that you just don't listen to. It's going to have a similar sort of encouraging aspect to do whatever you want.
Right. Another thing that stuck out to me was they're called Blackie's warrants. These are warrants that don't target individuals, but they can target companies that they suspect of housing illegal immigrants. So this is just ripe for abuse, right? You could go to like a meat packing plant and just raid it, detain everyone, not charge them for a little bit, and make a big spectacle out of it, right? And I'm sure you'll find people who did break the law, and that's fine. But I think going back to some of these busing policies done by the GOP governors, I think you'll probably have similar media spectacles when it comes to trying to detain people.
Sure. And if I also wanted to talk about another thing that I think that I noticed that was really bothering me when I suffered through reading a little bit of this, and I feel stupider for having done so. But the way that they're trying to blackmail cities into changing their policies, right? Whether or not you get grants and stuff as much as like security grants depends on whether or not you're a sanctuary state. So that's a little problematic to have policy blackmail. But what's worse is they want to insist that states share their DMV and voter information, right? There's really only one reason why you need voter information. If you're trying to carry on with your complete fraud of your voter conspiracy theories about illegal immigrants voting, right? It's not an accident that this stuff makes its way into everything they want to do. Not just in this aspect of Project 2025, but every time Trump speaks, every time anything happens, the benchmark for are you a loyalist is do you agree that the election was stolen and what are you doing to fix it? So we should keep an eye out for, and we'll see this every time they have something, somewhere in there, they like to sneak in a little bit about, oh, well, we got to do this because of, the last election was stolen. We can't let them do it again.
Yeah, it's a huge red flag. And similarly, one of the mandates that they want to do is have the Department of Treasury provide tax information on illegal immigrants. Right. One interesting thing about the IRS is they don't care if you're making money selling drugs, if you're a contract killer. They just want their money. Right.
Ask Al
Um,
Capone.
so, the fact that DHS would end up getting this tax information is just another huge red flag.
And amusingly, it would increase our deficit because then illegal immigrants that now file taxes would stop.
Right. Um, and to me, the next thing that really angered me, we have these visas for victims of human trafficking. They're contingent on you either suffered really intense physical or mental abuse, or you are going to testify and put to help put traffickers in prison. And they want to get rid of these visas because they say, oh, well, we already had these other types of visas where the cap is just 200 people. And that just seems so crazy to me that you're going to disincentivize people to come forward to help prosecute human traffickers. And it just goes to show you that their cost benefit analysis is just really, really bad, because I think everyone agrees that human trafficking is bad and we should do what we can to get rid of it. And these people are legitimate victims, and to just say, all right, too bad, so sad, you're going away. And even if we have a case, you're not going to be helped.
Well,
That's
it's obviously horrible, but I don't think it comes as a surprise if you really take into account what they're doing here. I can't help but being reminded, and here I'm going to go my elitist educational background sort of stuff, but it reminds me of a Pirandello play. Nobel Prize winning poet or playwright from Italy wrote a play, Six Characters in Search of an Author. The idea is there's these characters, they should be a play, they need to find somebody to write a play for them. Well, here they have, hey, this is our policy, we need to get there. And they're going to use everything they can to get there, changing and really perverting in a lot of ways. Although that might be a little bit strong of a word, but I don't necessarily think so when we're talking about these warrants, right? These visas. Just changing every aspect of the current setup in order to get to the policy they've already determined this is what we want to do. Right. So it's sort of their overriding concern is we need to stop people from coming here. We need to get rid of them. Back to the nativism we talked about earlier. And what can we do to make that happen? And everything that we've talked about here in terms of 2025 is exactly that. Taking the existing structure, changing it so it makes it easier to have the policy outcomes that we want. What the individual consequences are irrelevant to this sort of decision making, which is really sad.
Yeah. So the document is in our show notes. Give it a read if you'd like. I'm sure you'll find some other things that you find distasteful that we didn't cover. Okay, so now let's talk about how Kamala Harris will likely handle border security and immigration policy. During the convention, she said that she would sign the bipartisan border bill. So I want to kind of go over the elements of this bill and kind of circle back to the original Gang of Eight bill to see how big of a difference the shift has been from the Democrats' perspective. We like to call it a compromise bill. Jonathan, would you describe it as that?
We talked about this before, and to me, it's more like the Democrats have decided, this is a problem all of a sudden. Okay, we'll agree to whatever you want, and more or less, it's basically we'll bend over and you can tell us what you want us to do. And that's what they kind of did. It's the most conservative bipartisan bill that I think you can imagine coming out of the Senate in terms of what to do with immigration. In a lot of ways, I think I made this analogy to you. We were talking before recording this. The immigration issue reminds me, oddly, of the Korean War. We defined Korea as being sort of outside of our main national interest. We didn't care that much until it was, right? Once the North Koreans invade, all of a sudden we can't allow this. And I think the Biden administration kind of did something similar with immigration. It was sort of, as you said earlier, kind of a back burner issue until basically the border is on fire. It's a little bit of exaggeration, but it's all of a sudden it's a big issue. And they're like, we better do something. If we want to do something quickly, we better show that we can be tough, and we'll go along with Republican desires in terms of what we ought to do to rein things in. And like I think we mentioned before, or worth mentioning, right? There's no pathway to citizenship to be found in here,
right?
And for the longest time, that was the ultimate deal breaker for any Democratic compromise on the border, right? If you're going to do anything on the border, increase security, increase enforcement, all that, we need to have a pathway to citizenship. Well, not anymore, right? All of a sudden, they see that people are like, people are put off by this. This is bad, and this is bad throughout the country. It's just not bad in El Paso and other border towns. It's bad elsewhere because, as you said, Governor Abbott was successful for him sending immigrants all over the country and overwhelming some infrastructure in a lot of cities. So people are taking note of this and like, this isn't the best thing. We need to do something about it. And so we get this bipartisan compromise, which is more of a Democrats saying, okay, well, good, we'll try it your way.
Right. So in some ways, I would say the way the GOP played this, it was extremely hardball. And
Definitely.
They got basically everything they wanted. Here are the things that the left got. They got free counsel, legal counsel, for unaccompanied minors. They increased the caps for legal immigration by roughly 10%. And then Afghan evacuees have a pathway to citizenship.
That's really it. Shouldn't be a left issue.
Right. So nothing for dreamers, no implementation of DACA, none of that. So I think we should kind of talk about what the actual problem is now. As we alluded to before, the problem and the people who come here shifts, right? Right now, I would characterize the current situation as asylum claim abuse. People are coming from, they're still coming from Mexico and Central America, but we actually have a significant amount of people coming from Venezuela now. I think the number of immigrants is about 25% from Venezuela. We also have people flying in from China, Africa, into Central America or Mexico, and then trying to cross the border. So the problem has definitely changed. And
I think I would agree with you there. I think definitely that we have a lot of people claiming asylum because they know how to game our system. Right? When you're an economic refugee, that's bad. It's bad if you're suffering economic crisis, but that doesn't make you an asylum candidate.
Right.
At least it shouldn't. And part of the reason I think we're in such a problem is that when asylum is abused, and I think that's commonly perceived throughout the country, right, that this isn't, something's wrong with the way we do asylum, right? But there's no compromise coming from the legislature. It's like, well, if there's no compromise coming, then the harsh approach is going to be more popular. At least if Trump cracks down, you're not going to let these people, I'm sort of parroting a response here. If Trump cracks down, you're not going to have all these people slipping through claiming asylum when really they're just here to make money. Right. And so I think Democrats realizing, hey, we haven't come up with another option to stop this. We better glom onto this one, right? The Republicans have an idea. It's not as bad as Trump's approach. Let's see if we can make some hay with it.
Right. So right now, the backlog for processing asylum claims is immense. We're talking about 10 years.
Right, because they let basically the policy has been anybody that says, hey, I want asylum, they're like, okay, come on in, we'll process you.
Yeah, you get a hearing.
And you get to have a job in the meantime.
Yeah, sometimes, not everyone
Sometimes,
does.
that's true. Not every time, I should say.
They have a program called catch and release where it's like you're caught. They do a little bit of due
I don't think
diligence.
they call it catch and release.
Well, yeah, um, but they say
Republicans do.
right. But they are allowed into this country. They say, all right, come back in 7 years on this court date, and you know what? A significant amount of them don't because there's no incentive to. So we have this massive backlog where it could take 7 to 10 years to complete your hearing. Now, with this bill, you're going to get a hearing within 6 months. And it's much harder to qualify for asylum. So it's good for all parties, assuming you qualify for asylum, right?
Right.
If
It's
you
not
don't,
so good for the people who
yeah.
don't.
But you know what? That's the way it is. I think
I think we should probably go into a little bit more than that, right? I mean, it's just the way it is. I think that's a little callous for us to. I think we, there's a reason we can't. If we're overwhelmed by
right,
migrants, say at one time that we're not ready for, that makes us a problem. We have a legitimate legal immigration system, right? That could use some expansion as well,
sure.
right? But I think the main issue is if people are just storming the border, I don't want to use that quite, flooding the border, let's say, we can't
Invading,
really.
I think, is the
Invading. That's right. I forgot. But we can't incorporate them for efficiently or well into our society in the way
right.
we can if it's a more orderly process.
Exactly.
And I think that's the rationale I think the Democrats are relying on when they say that this is a good idea, because in a lot of respects, you can't just have chaos at the border, right? It reverberates throughout the country, especially when people like Governor Abbott are shipping immigrants to cities just to cause trouble.
Right. And another pretty strong aspect of this bill is they're increasing the number of detention beds by 50%, right? So you'll have 50,000 detention beds. So you are going to stay there for up to 6 months now, as opposed to just entering the country and then never attending your hearing. Also, they are giving really strong emergency powers to the Secretary of Homeland Security. So basically, I think the numbers are something along the lines of if you have 8,500 encounters in a single day, that triggers an automatic shutdown. If you have an average of 5,000 over a 7-day period, 5,000 daily, over that 7-day period, automatic shutdown of the border. And basically, when we say automatic shutdown of the border, we're not processing anyone, whether you're legally coming here or not. So that's really, really intense.
Yeah, I think sort of the take-home message here, I think that we want to make sure we're getting across is that the Democrats have come a long way, right?
Sure.
This is far more reactionary than anything they would have agreed to at all over the past 20 or 30 years even, right? And so I think it shows quite clearly that they're concerned that the average voter is worried about what's going on at the border. They're not going to get the Trump supporters to come over to the Democratic side with this sort of legislation. But it can show uncommitted voters, moderate voters that, hey, you know what? They realize that this is a problem. We're going to have to do something about it.
Yeah. Now, what I find interesting is how quiet progressives are when it comes to criticizing this bill, right? We look back at the convention and everyone seemed pretty unified. But this is a pretty intense sticking point.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, though, your option is we can shut up about this or we get Donald Trump.
Right. And that's clearly what it is.
And usually a couple loonies on the far left will say, oh, we're going to make you have people like Cornel West and Jill Stein who are opposed to anything remotely resembling compromise. And they're still out there. But it's interesting that most people in Congress are getting behind this and realizing, you know what, this isn't great, but it's better than what Donald Trump would do.
Right. What will be interesting is how the Senate ends up. I think if the Democrats end up taking the Senate, you might end up getting some additional pathways to citizenship, assuming they get rid of the filibuster.
Well, that's the
Um,
big assumption there too, right?
right. If they don't get rid of the filibuster, then I think this bill has a pretty high chance of happening.
What's
Um,
interesting is we should talk about that at a later time, because a lot of the people that are hardcore against getting rid of the filibuster are gone, right?
right.
Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin will be gone. So I think there's a decent chance. And the one thing I just want to say about that, if I'm in charge of the Democratic Party, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do that first, because I know that the Republicans are going to do that next time they have an opportunity to do it, because Mitch McConnell has really kind of lost sway there.
Right.
That would be my thought.
So, because this bill didn't pass, the current administration had to do something, right? So what they ended up doing was they said, "Hey, if you don't come to a port of entry, you're just automatically rejected. Period." And the number of encounters that we have now have gone down drastically. So there is some truth to the fact that some executive action could have been taken at some point, right? And it is a bit sad that it took this long to act. But it's also equally sad that Republicans had almost all of their ideas on the table, ready to be implemented, and then because Donald Trump said no, or because they wanted to lie about what's actually in the bill.
Now, I think you can probably stop at the first, right? I think the only reason this isn't law is because Donald Trump said no. Most of the time, I think without that, every Republican who said no, more or less, would be like, "Yay, we got him to do what we wanted him to do," right?
I don't know.
The lies you're talking about are their explanation to make people believe they're not just tanking it for political reasons. Okay. So yeah, the next thing I wanted to sort of change our focus here a little bit. Talk a little bit about economics. I think, as we mentioned before, voters say this is their number one issue, right? They will tell you that specifically inflation and prices are a big problem, and that's going to drive a lot of people's votes, right? And what's interesting is you'll hear a lot of Democrats saying, well, you know what? The economy is really good. There's a lot of positive trends. Job market is good. The stock market is good. Inflation is actually coming down quite a bit. But that doesn't seem to resonate with a lot of people, because they don't care, right? They look at how the economy is affecting them. And the common refrain is that people see higher prices in the grocery store, okay? And it's hard to argue with that, because it's basically true. Food prices are up. People are paying more for things they consume, and they don't really have ready options to have something else that they're going to replace that with. And this is a problem for the Democrats, because prices are not going to go down, or at least systematically. And we don't want them to. If prices go down when you have deflation, that messes up the entire economy. You can't pay your debts because your money is worth less when you go to pay your debt each time. And so debtors default. Companies have to cut back on prices because people don't have as much money to spend. And then they have to cut back on workers because they're not getting as much money in from the products they're selling more cheaply. All sorts of bad things happen if we have deflation. So we don't want that. We can't encourage that. And again, here's my turn to plug the show notes. There's a link down below about what happens in more detail if there's a deflation. You can also look at what happened in Japan in the 90s and early 2000s. Not a good situation. So we're not going to go for deflation, but we do see some problematic, I guess, policy ideas like, oh, we're going to stop price gouging, which sounds great, but if you dig into it, seems sketchy at best in terms of anything that will actually happen. I'd be surprised if it really went anywhere. So the idea is the Democrats are working to lower inflation in general, but more or less that's up to the Fed. And the Fed's done a fairly decent job with it. Inflation has come down, and we haven't had the kind of economic crash that pretty much all the other industrial nations have gone through in recovery from COVID. Our inflation is up, but it's coming down. It's at a reasonable number right now. The problem is people see the prices are still high, and they don't remember that inflation always happens, right? Your prices are always higher than they were in a previous administration. That's just the way inflation works, right? Whether it's hot enough, it's too high is another story, right? And so why I wanted to bring this up today is just was reading today, in fact, about gas prices. And gas prices for Labor Day are the lowest they've been in 3 years. And I think that's an interesting development, because gas prices are literally advertised everywhere. You drive down the street, you see gas prices. You don't see grocery prices the same way. And so I'm probably wondering, well, why does that matter so much? And I think that that's interesting because, right, we have a pretty clear gender gap for Harris supporters. Women support Harris very well. Men, okay, but not as well as they did under Biden, and much less than women support Harris. Women tend to do the shopping in relationships. I got data for this, so we're not just kind of making this up. This is actually true, and probably not a surprise to most people. So they see these prices up close and personal. That seems to be baked in already to the gender distribution. Men don't. So it's logical to assume from this that if they're going to see prices, they're going to see these gas prices. I don't think it's going to have any impact on the hardcore Trumpers, but it might be the kind of thing that resonates with an undecided voter. Like, hey, you know what? Inflation has been bad, but hey, check it out. Gas prices are down. Do you think that this is going to have any kind of lasting impact, Justin?
I'm a little skeptical because there's just such a sour taste in people's mouths. We can go to like a hot tub analogy, right? You're used to the hot tub just getting hotter and hotter. But in this particular circumstance, it's like, ooh, wow, I really felt that price increase, right? So I think, time heals all wounds. I don't know if the timing is going to work out well. And gas prices are something where there's so much fluctuation that I don't think it's going to have as much of an impact as, say, the price of eggs, right? Or just the price of groceries. I do think that if gas prices go up significantly before the election, that's going to hurt a lot more, right? Because as you said, that is something that is advertised. But I don't think people are going to say, ooh, gas prices are getting lower. I think inflation is, we're on the tail end of it. But, we'll see, right?
So I think the one thing that argues sort of in favor of it mattering is, one, that when you talk about the grocery prices and the price of eggs, that, again, a lot of men who now Harris has a deficit with, they're not seeing this.
Sure.
People men in relationships do far less shopping than women, right? So they're going to be exposed, I think, to these gas prices a lot more. And also local news, and from just looking at the internet today, local news and such is all over this. Gas prices are lower. They like to they always cover gas prices around holidays. And it seems to have a real impact on how much people drive for holidays. So I think people are going to notice this. Whether it's enough to outweigh what else is going on, it's like, okay, well, maybe, I would be all over this too if I'm the Harris campaign, right? I'm driving this home as much as possible. Hey, you know what? You're talking about inflation, but we're getting it under control. Check it out. The gas prices are down, lowest on the holiday they've been in years. So that's something I would certainly make a point of.
Yeah, we're just in such a weird time, I think, because as you mentioned before, like in aggregate, the data looks really good. I think there's polling as well that says, hey, my own financial state is, fairly good. But then everyone perceives that, well, everyone else is having a bad time. So we just have this weird perception of what reality actually is.
That's kind of an American phenomenon with politics too, isn't it, though? Because a lot of times Congress is dog shit, but my congressman is great.
Right. Yeah.
We do that with a lot of things. It is an interesting sort of aspect to American political life.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm just very skeptical. And also, economists and the media in general, they view things in the aggregate, right? Mm-hmm. You say, oh, the S&P 500 is at record highs. Well, that's an aggregate measure. What happens if your individual stock isn't performing well? What happens if your portfolio doesn't have a lot of these tech stocks, right? It's just
fair. That doesn't really apply to most of these undecided moderate voters.
No, of course not. But it's just like another, data point where it's like you have this disconnect between the aggregate and, individual microeconomic industries.
What I do think, though, in this case, right, the story is that inflation has been coming down, and it has.
Right.
And it seems that Harris seems to has gotten a little bounce in terms of handling the economy versus how well Joe Biden did,
right,
in terms of polling. And this could be, it might be, hopefully for her sake, it's interpreted as another data point in that. It's like they tell us inflation's going down. I'm kind of skeptical, but now I'm seeing that gas prices actually are coming down. Again, that's not really a sign that inflation is coming down. People don't really, as I mentioned, sort of distinguish between prices, the actual price versus inflation. That's kind of a different thing that kind of gets lost. But if people see that prices are down on gas, maybe that's the kind of thing that might break through in terms of, well, maybe these other things that I've been hearing are actually starting to come true a little bit too. Not a sure thing. Obviously, people's attention span and interest in analyzing real economic trends is kind of limited. They want to know what it means to them. But if you were planning to take a trip somewhere and it costs you $5 cheaper or $10 cheaper to fill up your tank, that's something people take note of.
Yeah. I do think this phenomenon is going to be also, the best case scenario is going to be that the inflation data just becomes less salient, right? Mm-hmm. For the Democrats, the idea would be, you know what, we're okay. It's not great, but it's fine. So now I'm going to focus on the abortion issue, or, I'm going to focus on the crazy things that Trump says, right? Whereas the opposite is true for Trump. He would rather, some sort of, mild economic crisis to occur, right? Or for, prices to go up just so that it remains salient, right?
Sure. And I think that data like this makes it much more convincing for the Democrats to say things are under control. Let's not focus on this so much. Let's focus over here. Because if you can say, if for example, it was the other way and gas prices were at a record high, you'd have a lot harder time convincing people that, you know what, we've got it under control. Don't trust us. It's a little bit easier sell to do that when things like this happen. Yeah. So I don't think it's going to change election results one way or another, but I think it's interesting to take note that, you know what, here's some good economic news that might break through where other good economic news doesn't quite so much on the individual level.
Right. So this is going to be a common theme that we discuss up until the election. In the future, we're going to have probably some dedicated segments. I know Harris has her housing policy that she came up with. Trump has his tariff policy. So we're going to go into deep dives in each of those policies at a recurring rate.
Let's say deepish, because I don't think anybody wants to hear us.
We will scratch the surface.
Nobody wants to hear us opine about the macroeconomics of tariffs for an extended length.
Anyway, I hope everyone enjoyed this talk on economics, as well as what to expect when it comes to immigration policy. So we'll see you next week.
Right.
Cheers.
Cheers.